Hello again, everyone. This is Ian Bell with a little online lecture about Chapter 2 for We Drink from Our Own Wells. I hope all of you had a fun time in Cancun and over by Merida for spring break. Before we get started, I would like to remind you that some of you have not been giving me very many journal entries. And as I told you when I was with you down in Cuernavaca, please don't put those off until the end because you will not have any feedback as to what works in a given journal assignment or not. If you just give them all to me at once, then I will just simply grade them all. But if you give me one journal entry and then I can grade that and get it back to you, and then hopefully you can adjust your approach appropriately for subsequent journal entries, and your grade will be better in that sense. Okay, so this chapter is about hearing what the poor have to say about their economic and spiritual experiences. Now, as we've talked about previously, and as Gutierrez makes the point, the poor tend to be ignored both economically and spiritually because their plight is ignored. Those in power do not like to be reminded of the poor and the fact that some people are living at a standard of life that is not well, quite frankly, that is not acceptable. And also, along with the notion that they are living a life of poverty that is unacceptable, there's the idea that they have no contribution to make. What contribution can they make to society if they only take and they are perceived not to make any contributions? Likewise, why should people in the church listen to the poor? They also are viewed as not having much to offer to the church because their presence can be disconcerting, and they often challenge the message that comes from the pulpit. If the pastor is preaching about the love and the generosity and the mercy of God, that very well be the case, but then in the pews there is the presence of those who testify to a different reality. If God is a God of love and mercy, then why are the poor? Then why are there poor? And the presence of the poor cannot be ignored if the poor are in church. So the same forces that tend to push the poor to the side economically and socially also tend to push the poor to the side in the church. They do not stand to make any contributions, and their experience does not count. Now, this, unsurprisingly, is not the case in poor churches. In congregations that are comprised of mostly or even entirely of poor persons, the issue of poverty and the problems of poverty, both economically and spiritually, cannot be ignored. And although wealthy churches from more powerful social situations, they can ignore it, but if the entire church is comprised of the poor, there's just no denying that the poor people are in the church. And thus, in poor churches, there's an acknowledgement of the desperation of their condition. But there's an interesting optimism that is present in poor churches. Okay? That poor communities or oppressed communities are convinced that better days are ahead, that they are convinced that God will deliver them. An analogy to this is the mindset of people in Mexico. When I was down there, I was surprised that there's rebar sticking out of all of these houses. And I talked to Nick about it. I said, well, these houses look unfinished. And he said, well, yes, but that's not the entire story. That there is an optimism in Mexico that pretty soon we will have enough money to put on another room to the house, or we'll put on another level, or we will renovate our house. All we need is a little more time and a little more money, but we are convinced that that time and that money is coming, and so we better plan and look forward to this better life that's coming. And so for Gutierrez, this is the song of the poor. The song of the poor is singing praises to God in anticipation of that coming liberation. Not that the situation is not desperate now, but it arises out of a conviction that God, as in the Bible, will hear the cry of the poor and take action. Now, I hope that some of you have had the opportunity to attend church in Mexico. Church services in Latin America, or in primarily Spanish speaking parishes, even in the United States, they have a different feel to them. That the music tends to be more upbeat rather than the somber songs based on a huge organ. You will have a smaller choir often with guitars and flutes sometimes and other instruments. There will often be dancing. This is particularly the case according to a friend of mine who's from the Dominican Republic. She says that in the Dominican Republic they dance throughout the entire service. And for most of our congregations here in the United States, dancing would not be well received. And so there's an interesting juxtaposition. On the one hand, you have parishes filled with desperately poor people. But on the other hand, these poor people are convinced that the liberation of God is coming. God will not put up with the situation much longer, and their freedom from oppression is coming. And so, in a real sense, then, this song is a reaffirmation of the resurrection. Sometimes the resurrection gets lost because we live in a world that is filled with sickness and despair and hardship. That is because, to a large extent, our societies and our relationships are governed by sin rather than the love that is proclaimed by Christ in the gospel. And so if the Easter event is Christ's overcoming the powers of sin and death, we can apply that to the social and economic situations of the world today. That the sinful breakdown of relationships that results in poor people, if sin does not have the last word, then Christ has overcome the powers of sin. We do not have to be resigned to that way of acting in the world. We don't have to resort to, well, that's just the way it is. There will always be poor people. There's nothing you can do about it, so don't even try. Okay? We don't have to resign ourselves to living in a society where we have to lock ourselves into our homes at night for fear of intruders. We don't have to worry about people breaking into our cars or random acts of violence or anything like that. You don't have to accept that, there are winners in life and there are losers in life. There does not always have to be violence or crime or hatred or bigotry. Okay? That these things only have the last word if Christians let them have the last word. And if they let them have the last word, then they are ignoring the power of the resurrection that lies at the heart of the hope of the poor. Okay? Now, also, the song of the poor is not intended solely for the poor. Poor Christians invite the wealthy and the powerful to join them in this song, if only they will take the time to listen to the song of the poor. The song of the poor that is at once a song of desperation, our situation is intolerable, but also hope born in the resurrection that the suffocating nature of their life will be overcome. Okay. In the future, I will be providing more of these podcasts. Next week, Nick and I hope to have Chapter 3 online, and hopefully we will be experiencing with some visual elements as well. And so that is what's coming down the pipe. I hope that you are all enjoying your time in Mexico, and that your journal entries will start to appear in my email inbox soon. Have a good week, and I will talk to you later.